أقدر.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everybody. Fergus Dolan here from NALA. We're delighted to have you here for our webinar today on Universal Design for Learning, Approaches to Teaching Reading for Everyone. And we're thrilled to have Michelle McGrane with us. Michelle is a tutor and a trainer with Dublin and Dún Laoghaire ETB. And just before Michelle starts, my colleague Derv Ryan is going to tell you about exciting new resources for literacy and ESOL that Derv's worked on for the last while. Okay, Derv, over to you.
Thanks, Fergus. Hi everyone. Hope everyone's well. It's lunchtime. I'm just going to share one slide with you. So, NALA have just published 4 new workbooks at levels 1 to 2, and they're 30 pages long, and they are filled with exercises for learners to learn new vocabulary and words about the 4 topics: places in the town, clothes and weather, health and well-being, and free time activities. And then there's exercises for practicing reading, writing, spelling, and there's some speaking exercises in there too. Originally, these were developed as an ESOL literacy resource with those learners in mind. But we did broaden the description, and we do think it could be useful as well for literacy learners who would be confident in their English language or speak as a native speaker. We worked with Angus O'Riordan. Some of you might know Angus. He's worked in the past in the Dublin Adult Learning Centre, DALC, and in Sporazzi now. And he's done many professional development events with Fergus over the years as well. So he really helped us develop the content. And then we were very lucky to get Padraig Glennon in the Dublin Adult Learning Centre and the students there to test and pilot a version of the workbooks in the classroom. And then we made changes based on their feedback and the feedback from our own adult literacy educators in NALA, the tutors who work with people over the phone. So the 4 workbooks are available on our website. You can download PDF versions, and the PDF versions are also fillable. For example, like a student can fill out the exercises on a PDF on a device or computer and then save that file for themselves. And then there are hard copies available to order as well. And I'll share the links to both of those in the chat. So just wanted to let you all know that they're available now. Thank you, Fergus.
Thanks, Derv. And yeah, you can see Derv in the chat. A few people said they're excellent resources. So thanks for that, Derv. Okay, Michelle, over to you. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks, Dervla, as well for the work that you put in on those, because I know tutors are always looking for fantastic materials, and especially at the lower levels. Really good to have those. Okay, now just sorry. Sharing.
Yeah, that's coming up, Michelle.
Okay, it doesn't seem to be coming up in presenter mode, is it? Is it coming
up? It's not
in
in presenter mode yet.
No. And it was a few seconds ago. Okay, there it is
There
now.
it
Is
is
that okay
now,
for
yeah.
everybody? Apologies for that.
Yeah.
I don't know why I didn't come up in presenter mode initially. So what we're going to do today is we are looking at some approaches to teaching reading in the context of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. That's essentially what we're doing. So we'll click on. And we're going to overview a few of the key elements or the key components of what is universal design for learning. I am not an expert in that, so I'll just be looking at a few key elements because I want to look at the reading in that context. Consider some approaches to reading and look at the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches, and try to look at them in the context of UDL. And I will give a little bit about what the ones that I think, are the more preferable approaches and why. So just to mention a word about statistics before I start, there's a few statistics referred to in this particular presentation. However, I haven't really provided a full list of where those various statistics and references come from. I felt that was maybe a little bit overly academic for this particular presentation. However, if people are interested in knowing where the stats come from or how they can get a handle of more information, they are welcome to contact me in that regard. Okay, so first of all, just going to look at two key components of UDL. And just to be clear, UDL is universal design in the context of learning. So the first thing is what might be essential for some may be beneficial for all. And this is a fairly simple concept. It essentially means that the approaches that we use for people who may have extra needs or different needs to the majority need not be viewed as additional or extra work, but can be incorporated into the overall approach of teaching. And that, in fact, in many cases, the approaches used can be beneficial for all of the people in the learning group, not only the people for whom they were originally intended. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you an example of that here today. And the other sort of important element or component of UDL that I will be referring to is the concept of being proactive, not reactive. And I suppose one interpretation of those particular words is that we will look at sort of thinking ahead, anticipating, planning. And that's essentially what I'm going to be doing. I want to look for a moment at what we mean by reading. And I don't think anybody here will be surprised when I say that reading is a complex set of skills and processes. I don't think I need to tell anybody that in this particular group. This little diagram kind of gives one visual representation of what's involved in reading. And so you've got your sensory input. It's important to note at this moment that the sensory input is twofold. It is both audio and visual. In other words, we hear the sounds, we see the spellings. So those are the two key sensory inputs. At the initial stage, we are expected to be able to pay sufficient attention to receive that sensory input. We have to organize it and we have to make selections. In order for that to stay in the memory, we need to have that capacity to make comparisons and sort. Then at the perceptual level, we need to be able to process what we are seeing, identify, possibly look at patterns. So that would be an example of interpretation. And again, in order to maintain that learning and memory, we need to be able to retrieve what we have already learned and use it and apply it to new learning, to integrate it into new learning as we build. And then at the more advanced thinking level of learning, we have to understand what's happening, what we're reading. We have to maybe make reasoned calculations or assumptions, predictions, and we have to plan, and a very simple example of that is like, what do you think is going to happen next? And so on and so forth. I think a significant point that I would like to make at this moment is that the way that the information is learned, and so from the process of sensory input, from that stage right through to the very end, the comprehension, I have observed that it greatly influences the extent to which the learner can remember what they have learned. I am making this point because time and again, over my many, many years of teaching, I've had a lot of teachers say to me, and I'm sure you've all heard this as well, you put so much work in to your class, you carefully bring your learner through each stage, you feel that they've got it, they've nailed it, they've got it down, they're doing great. Then comes the summer holidays. They come back in September and it's all a little bit soul destroying because you feel that, if so many learners or so many teachers have said to me, I feel like I have to start all over again. Forgot everything, and obviously that's not what we want. So what I'm going to suggest to you here is that during this session that you think of how the information is processed and originally learned influences the extent to which they can remember it at a later stage. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So what am I basically, these are my thoughts on the things that I've said just so far. I mean, essentially, first of all, reading by its very nature involves both audio and visual input. Almost simultaneously, you're expected to look and listen, or you're expected to read and hear. And in many situations, for example, if you imagine a teacher at the top of a class pointing at some writing that's on the board, maybe reading it out loud, the learner is often expected to consider the visual and audio input simultaneously. I feel, and perhaps I feel this almost implicitly, please feel free to argue with me if you want to, maybe at the end, that doing it step by step allows the learner to process the information in manageable chunks. So it's generally an understanding of teaching that breaking things down into smaller tasks helps with regards to the way that a learner learns something. Equally, helping the learner by organizing the information at every stage, including the sensory input stage, right through, allows the learner to process the information more effectively. So it's about how we present it, how we give it. I'm not telling you anything really here that you don't know. I'm just organizing these thoughts for the next part. Well, and we do need an approach which can aid and support at all times from sensory right through to comprehension. So I'm going to just look at two phonics-based approaches to learning, the analytic and the synthetic approaches. And I'm looking at these because they are two of the most commonly used approaches when teaching reading. And I'm just going to look at them in the context of UDL and, to what extent they meet the criteria of UDL. So this is just a very quick overview. So synthetic phonics usually starts with the sounds. It's heavily focused on blending. We start with the parts of the word and build into the whole. The learner is decoding pretty much from the get-go. And it generally leads to faster, more effective skills in terms of decoding. Analytic phonics tends to look at the word and then look for patterns and discernible, for example, rhymes and things like that. It looks at analysing the word, breaking it down. So we're talking about the whole to the part. The decoding is not always effective, and usually what we do is we decode at a later stage. And it's very good for context in the sense that it allows the learner to consider the meaning of the words and the context of what's being said. So what does analytic phonics look like in the classroom? Well, it involves teachers to analyze. It involves teaching learners to analyze. Sorry, excuse me. And so generally, the initial focus is on known words. And they look at the letter sound patterns. And so they would often look at things like comparisons like rhyming, the similar onset in words, and various other word analyses. I just want to draw your attention to the word known words. And maybe you won't be surprised when I tell you that my original experience was with ESOL. And so immediately, if you're speaking with somebody or you're working with a learner who has limited English knowledge, limited language, possibly no English knowledge, no language skills, well, then they don't have known words. So immediately we have a potential problem there, potentially. So it works from the whole to the part. This is just a brief breakdown, okay? It does a lot of grouping and organizing words into word families, and looking at context clues, looking at the initial sounds, the last sounds, the rhyming sounds, quite a lot of use of pictures, flashcards, things like that. And I suppose there's a lot of visual, and the learner is also encouraged to kind of maybe try and guess the word, by looking at the pictures, things like that. There is what is called implicit instruction, which as a phrase I always find slightly dubious because it suggests that by giving lots and lots of examples of any particular thing, that the learner will make certain conclusions, that the conclusion will almost be obvious by a lot of examples being provided. And one of my concerns is that that simply is not always the case. It is the case a lot of the time, but not always. And so that's a bit of an issue. Okay. So then looking briefly at synthetic phonics, you can see that sorry, just to say, you can see that I am moving quite quickly through these. And the reason for that is that this particular presentation is not really about what is synthetic phonics or what is analytic phonics or what is UDL. Rather, I want to look at these approaches in the context of UDL. So to a small extent, I'm kind of assuming that maybe you've heard of these things before. However, if there is anybody here with us today that kind of doesn't really know, you're certainly welcome to ask questions. And equally, I'm more than happy to talk about these things if you want to contact me afterwards for more information. So looking at synthetic phonics, there's a sort of a more step by step. So first of all, we learn the phonemes, and phonemes is just a fancy word for the sounds. And then they learn the graphemes, which is a fancy word for the letters and spellings. And they learn to associate those together. And then they learn about blending, which is quite an unnatural thing if you think about it, because, you know, if you say the three sounds, for example, the word cat, cat, it's more natural to human beings to say those three sounds separately, cat. It's actually quite a skill to be able to blend those into one word, cat. And equally, when as a teacher, it comes to the point that you then have to try and say those words in a way that the learner can hear the three sounds separately, you'll often find yourself making some strange gesticulations and facial expressions as you try to teach the learner each individual sound. There is a very cumulative, a systematic and cumulative approach. So it's very systematic. They start with CVCs, that's the consonant, vowel, consonant. They move on to the CCVCs, CVCCs, CCVCCs, 2 syllables, 3 syllables, and so on and so forth. So it's very systematic. And usually, I will say usually because this is not necessarily, but usually the learner will learn to read the words almost before they learn the meaning of the words, so that they are learning how to read, that is to decode and say the sounds, blend them together, and then verbally say the word and then learn what that word means, which is a little bit different to maybe what we normally think of when we think of teaching reading and language. I just want to talk briefly about word building, which I sort of think is maybe one of the absolutely key activities in the synthetic phonics approach. So the idea, and I think in the context of UDL, it's particularly important. So word building is where the learner builds the word, first of all, orally by speaking it and hearing it, and orally and hourly, and then they write the word. And it's a very simple process, but in my opinion, it is hugely important in terms of UDL. I'm going to try and explain why in a minute, but I'll just tell you what it is first. So with word building, we teach the sounds first. So the learner will learn, we usually start with the simple ones that are one letter. So each individual letter and the sound, which is the most commonly used sound for that letter. So for example, the letter F, and so on. And we usually teach them in groups. Most books or systems, there are many, will teach them usually in groups of kind of maybe 8 at a time, and then they keep adding on and adding on. Then the learner learns to blend the sounds that they have learned. Now, at this point, there's no piece of paper in front of them. There are no handouts. There are no pictures. This is pure audio, oral, old school, teaching. And I remember when I started doing this, first of all, with learners, there was almost a sense of alarm. She's not giving us any handouts. We've nothing to write. I need to hold a pencil in my hand or something. And most learners actually still held a pen or pencil in their hand, almost for a sense of, I don't know, kind of maybe security, so that they felt they were doing something schooly. But in fact, what we do is we learn the sounds and then we simply look at the sounds. So for example, p, a. Put them together, that's pa, okay? P, a, n, pan, and we learn how to blend them. And the idea of word building is that you learn how to blend first before you proceed on to the writing. Having kind of practiced blending then with that particular group of sounds, whichever group of sounds you're working on that day, you then ask the learner to write the sounds. So having learned p, a, n is pan, they then write the letter P, the letter A, and the letter N by identifying them. They then look at the word, and at that point, we process the fact that they have now written the three sounds, if you like, to write three sounds. I think you know what I mean, that they can read them and say, oh, that's the word pan. We practice, and there are lots and lots of materials available, not as many as we might like, but there are plenty of materials available for adult appropriate materials to practice using groups of words in this strategic way. And we practice and we repeat and we build. Now, the reason I've described that particular process is because I want to talk about the subtle difference between that approach and the analytic approach. This is the synthetic approach. It's very subtle, but it's very important. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, this is where I talk about the stats. Roughly, most statistics, most research will tell us that approximately somewhere, depending on what research you're reading, somewhere between 10 and 25% of learners don't really achieve reading skills effectively from analytic approaches. And comparatively, most of the studies show that when a synthetic phonics approach is used, 95 to 99% of learners achieve competent reading skills, which might immediately raise the question, well, why on earth would you bother with one then and not the other if it's that black and white? But of course, these things are never quite that black and white. So there are a couple of reasons. One of them is that historically, and I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, but historically, in large primary school classrooms, there was a bit of an assumption that there will always be a couple of people in the class who aren't as good as the others and can't learn how to read. And that was almost accepted as a fact, as something that we just kind of put up with. And it was never really the case that there was any sort of suggestion that the teaching wasn't as effective. It was always just that that particular learner, or maybe one or two learners, just for whatever reason couldn't learn how to read. Unfortunately, those are the 10 to 25% of learners that I'm talking about. And what was actually happening there was that the teacher was probably operating a system of analytic phonics or some other learning process, and they weren't using a nice strategic, systematic, synthetic approach. The other thing then, I suppose the other side just to say is that the synthetic phonics, while demonstrating a high level of reading skills, does have some other sort of pitfalls, and there are some other reasons why it is not universally used. And I'm just going to talk about that now, if that's okay. Are we all right now, Fergus? No questions or keep going? Yes?
Yeah, keep going. No
Yeah.
questions so far.
When I started teaching this first, and I don't think anyone's going to be shocked when I announce that I tend to prefer and propose, I'm a great proponent of the synthetic phonics approach. Not as the only approach, but as a great example of universal design for learning, something that works for, I'm afraid to say 100%, but pretty much everyone that I've ever met that wants to learn how to read. When I started teaching it to other tutors, doing a tutor training, CPD and tutor training, the same concerns came up time and again. They said, this is boring. No adult will sit through this for 2 hours. Where's the context? They're just learning words. They're not really learning, there's no story. And when you compare it to previous approaches, which had involved make sure that you're teaching the learner what they want to learn, so reading the newspaper or reading a novel, whatever it is that they want to learn. And here we are with our kind of synthetic phonics approach, with our kind of boring lists, sometimes very simple lists, potentially something that might make somebody feel a bit babyish. There's not as much meaning, you know. I actually could completely understand the concerns that those tutors were expressing to me. And I think it's worth addressing that concern. There's no point in kind of glossing over that. That is a genuine concern. So these are the reasons why synthetic phonics is sometimes perceived as boring. These are the concerns, if you like. One is that by very nature of being decodable, graded books start with a very limited selection of words. If you imagine that the first book that you read is going to be only CVC words, by definition, that means that you have immediately restricted yourself to a very limited supply of words, and therefore the stories are going to be a bit. And I think we all know that from the graded books. You know, the stories tend to be a little bit kind of odd in the beginning, a little bit funny. Um, and equally, just to go to the, I'm jumping to the end, but they can be a little bit isolated from context because we are teaching words in a specific order, and that order is which ones are easiest to read and decode first, and not which words are most commonly used. The other great concern is this excessive focus on mechanics, that we're so focused on getting the learner to blend, decode, read out loud, remember all the sounds, put the sounds together. It's quite labor intensive that it might actually just kill the joy of learning of reading, sorry, so that the learner might actually get to the point that they go, I'm not actually bothered anymore. It's just not that much fun. And that was definitely a concern. Excuse me. I have a slight cough, so I hope you don't mind. I just have my tea with me. It's quite repetitive, a bit like drilling, a little bit like drilling. And again, there is a danger of learners becoming bored. So these are the concerns, or these are the reasons that synthetic phonics is not always embraced, even though it has shown to be quite successful. I will also say that in my experience and from my observations, it doesn't lend itself as effectively to very large groups. And so if you imagine a school teacher in a primary school with maybe 25, 30 kids, it's much more difficult to implement a systematic synthetic phonics approach with a large group. To some extent, we are a little bit lucky. I don't know if that's quite the word, but one of the benefits of adult education is that we tend to have smaller groups. And I think it's fair to say that ideally, the smaller the group, the better when it comes to synthetic phonics. 6 to 8 is probably sort of a perfect group. And so therefore, that is not always practicable in all situations. So that's just another reason that people don't always embrace the synthetic phonics approach. Okay, so I suppose it's worth looking at the counter arguments, if you like, to the potential boringness of synthetic phonics. And I really want to point to this one in particular, the motivation through success. What I have discovered is that if a learner is saying this is boring, it is because they already know the particular skills or knowledge that is being taught. 9 times out of 10, that has been my experience. And so I would argue that possibly that learner might not have been correctly placed in the right classroom, or that they simply don't need the teaching that's going on. They're a little bit higher. Learners who are being taught exactly what they want to learn, which in this case is, please teach me how to read, are not bored when somebody starts to teach them step by step in an understandable, comprehensible, systematic way. That is not boring. That is like manna to a learner who really wants that. And my experience is that they're generally quite excited when they feel that they're getting somewhere in that regard. And the second one, of course, also hugely important, is the sense of empowerment. I remember a learner telling me, describing a process when they began to learn how to read and how good they felt because there were so many words that they could read. However, they reached a point of critical mass. Essentially, your memory can only hold so much. And as there became more and more and more and more words, they became quite despondent and quite discouraged because they started to realize that they weren't going to be able to remember every single word. And so every new word that came along presented with a problem, a challenge. The problem for that learner was that they didn't have the ability to look at a brand new word and decode it using previously learned skills and knowledge. And that is absolutely what I sort of feel needs to happen at the early stages, is that when the learner has the skills, they feel, and this is what they tell me, they feel equipped. Bring it on. Let me have a go of this because now I kind of know how to try and do it. Okay? And also, I do believe that a good teacher can make any class fun, or certainly they can certainly give it a good whack. It's fair to say that giving synthetic phonics to implement that in a classroom is not an easy task. It's a high energy, hard work thing that you're doing in the classroom. And in order to bring that energy, you need to be ready and prepared. It's not an easy thing to do. I have had one or two instances where I've been delivering this tutor training program, and tutors have confidentially said to me after, mostly they love it and they say, yes, fabulous, now we can bring this back to our classroom. But I have had one or two that have said to me, I wouldn't be able for that. So that just sounds exhausting. It sounds like you never sit down in the classroom. It sounds really hard work. And they actually were kind of quite they just really didn't want to have to do it because it was quite hard. So I suppose it is quite an energetic class, and to that extent, I suppose that is where we kind of try and make it as interesting and fun as possible. I won't lie about that. And the other thing is that, something that's highly effective, success breeds success. So, if you feel you're doing great, if the teacher feels they're doing great, the other people feel they're doing great, that generates quite a high level of motivation, and that generally brings its own energy with it. So I suppose though that's kind of my answer, if you like, to the criticism, which is a genuine valid concern and a genuine doubt in tutors that maybe the synthetic phonics might be, is it boring? It sounds boring.
Michelle, we have a question here that might just be interesting now.
Yeah.
Um, would a learner's learning style be part of it, e.g., oral learning style, v kinesthetic learning style, synthetic phonics style, or analytic learning style? Is there a more natural flow in the analytical?
So, what I have observed from my sort of experience is that there are certainly a large percent, if you remember back to my statistic of kind of 10 to 25% who don't succeed, that would suggest that there are somewhere between 75% and 90% of people who do succeed. So, what I would say is that in an analytic approach, in a more a more generic approach, maybe a sort of a more not homeopathic, I'm trying to think of the right word, approach that this you will still have success with 75 to 90% of the learners. And that is the case if you look at primary schools or if you look at any situation where there's a more kind of broad approach. It's not that you will not learn how to read, it's that some people will not learn how to read. Now, there are a host of reasons for that. One of them may be the person's natural learning style. So some people might naturally be more attuned to audio, some might be more naturally attuned to the visual, and so on and so forth. Equally, there are some learners who just naturally get blending, some of them don't. And of course, then when we think about things like dyslexia has to do with, I suppose, to some extent, the way that we organize the information in your head, how you go from in not translating it from visual or sorry from audio information to visual information. All of those things may be the reason that 10 to 25% do not effectively succeed in learning how to read. So my answer to you is that the analytic approach that I'm looking at is definitely effective for the majority. But there is definitely a cohort within that which do not lend themselves effectively to learning how to read with that particular approach. And I suppose that what the stats are showing is that the synthetic phonics approach seems to work for everyone. And so perhaps there is an argument there for using that approach in a classroom so that everybody has the same chance to learn. And what I have sort of seen in my particular the groups of people that I work with is that it does work for everybody. And the people who maybe are not dyslexic or the people who don't have a particular learning challenge learn just as effectively with the synthetic phonics approach. So my argument is, if you have one approach that works for most and another approach that works for everyone, that's, I just think that's the way to go. Okay. So looking again, I hope that kind of answered the question. I was trying to, yeah, I hope so. We can come back to it if we feel that there's more to say on that. Looking again at the little diagram that I showed you earlier on. And I just like this diagram because I think it gives a good visual representation of the complexity involved in learning how to read. It's not just one skill. You have that sensory input coming in, but then there's a sort of a plethora of things that you have to do, in order to get to the point that you can read and understand and reason. Sorry, we'll go back for 1 second. If we look at the sensory input, for example, for a learner who possibly has dyslexia or has some difficulty with organizing their thoughts, the synthetic phonics approach is so organized that essentially it presents the information in a way which is manageable for somebody who has that sort of challenge. Because of the word building approach, which I described at the beginning, the learner does not receive both sensory inputs at the same time. They don't have to process the visual and the oral or the aural at the same time. They focus on the oral organizing and learning of thoughts first, and then they go on to focus on the visual representation of that oral information. And so by breaking it down into that sort of level of mini steps, the learner is able to compare and sort the information in a way that they actually are able to do it quite effectively. And with that, if you consider how I explained the word building, which really was just a very simple way of presenting basic words in the very beginning, what you will see is that what I'm suggesting is that small change in how that initial information is introduced to the learner, in other words, aural first and then visual, that small change makes a huge difference to a small proportion of your class. And for the rest of the class, it's fine. They learn it anyway. So what you are doing is presenting the information in a way that works for everybody. And what I have also noticed is that learners who learn in this way, the information, there's something about the way the information is processed, which is more about learning of a skill than knowledge that they have to remember. Consequently, it is more like learning how to swim or ride a bike than remembering lists of words, for example, as in, let's say, by way of an example, irregular verbs that learners learn, when they're doing ESOL. And so consequently, just like riding a bike, like the saying goes, or like swimming, even if you haven't done it for a certain period of time, let's say the summer holidays, or a period of time where you haven't done it for a while, it comes back more quickly. And so what I have noticed with my learners is that when I introduce the information in this way, and it doesn't seem like a huge difference, put the words on the board. No, don't put the words on the board. Present them hourly first. Make sure the learner can blend them, then get them to write them, then get them to read what they have written. That small change, by way of an example, improves the extent to which they can then use that information and build on that information and remember that skill going forward. And so what happens is they come back in September, they might have forgotten everything, but within a week it's all come back because they haven't really forgotten it, they just got a bit rusty. It's not gone because they are not relying in totally on memory. It's actually embedded at a deeper, deeper level. The memory is sort of more entrenched, for want of a better way of putting it. I hope I have kind of explained that, or it's quite a difficult concept, so I hope that I've kind of explained it correctly. Okay. So I've left a bit of space at the end here because I imagine that there are going to be some questions. I hope there are anyway.
Thanks a million, Michelle. That was
Okay.
really, really clear. And
Okay.
you always explain things well, and your enthusiasm generally rubs off on people. We have a question here, yeah, from Una Clancy. So Una's saying, from what I understand, these approaches are geared towards someone learning to read from scratch. I wonder, is there any place for aspects of synthetic phonics being used in a class where ESOL learners, for example, have already somewhat of a foundation in reading?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. A question which I asked myself so much at the beginning because I thought, okay, if we have a learner who's already got some learning, are we going to put them through the whole process of starting from scratch? Are they going to have to learn the whole thing all over again? And I suppose what I have, the kind of conclusion that I've come to is yes, but no. Let me explain exactly what I mean. You do a little bit have to go back and with the learner, look at how a word is created and how it's made. But in the instance where a learner already has some reading, then there's really no need for you to spend a lot of time doing this. So, with a new learner, for example, you can say, um, okay, well, first of all, you can very quickly go through some very basic sounds, and then you can simply explain to them, okay, let's really think about what a word is. When I say a word, sounds are coming out of my mouth and I'm blending them. And it is important that the learner understands that. And it is important, I think, at the beginning that you play some games around trying to say the individual sounds. Okay. But you don't have to look at that. For example, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to say 10 words to you now, and you tell me the three sounds that came out of my mouth, and I say, cat, man, tap, dog, whatever. Okay. It doesn't mean that you're saying to the learner, I think that you don't know these words. What you're saying to the learner is, let's just make sure that you definitely understand how words are made and how words are composed, you know? And so can you get the learner to go k, a, t? In my experience, quite a lot of learners, even who have a reasonable level of reading skill, won't actually necessarily be able to do this perfectly. And the reason for that is because they may have learned to read in a different way. And so they're simply not used to this kind of audio analysis of the word. However, if they are in an adult education classroom and they are learning how to read, we need to accept that they themselves are not fully happy with the skill level that they have. And therefore, we need to address the fact that they may need to learn new strategies. And so it's okay to say, I think, anyway, to say to the learner, okay, seems like you're getting pretty good at that now, blending, segmenting of sounds. Let's move on to bigger sounds. Can you do it when we do it this way? Can we do it when we do it that way? What I'm saying is that what might take 30 to 60 hours for one learner could be done in 2 hours for another learner. So it's almost like a sort of a crash course in synthetic phonics to start with. However, I think it's essential that the learner gets those skills before they move on, because one of the approaches in synthetic phonics that like is used quite a lot is that once you start to get to bigger words, I have a learner at the moment, and what we've done is we've looked at the 200 questions of the driving test theory test. There are 200 potential questions that a person can be asked when they're doing the driving theory. And we picked out all of the 3 and 4 syllable words. And what we're doing is, of those 3 and 4 syllable words, the learner is, and there would be quite a lot of words that maybe they wouldn't be familiar with. They're picking out the CVCs. We're looking at the CVCs, they're saying them, and they're writing each CVCs down. And it's kind of like a game. We're kind of saying, okay, let's see if using this strategy helps you to get to reading that word. So rather than saying we are going to do this step by step, I'm saying, let's see if this strategy works. Let's try it. So you are treating the learner in a more, I suppose, adult way. You're asking them to reflect on a particular strategy rather than saying, I'm going to teach you this step by step. But what you actually are teaching is the systematic step by step by step approach. I hope that makes sense. So there is a degree of interpretation or judgment on the part of um, the person who's teaching, the teacher. However, I do think that every skill needs to be taught and needs to be learned in order to move to the more difficult words. And most learners, in my experience, if I say to them, look, I know you know the simpler words. We call them the easy words and the hard words. I know you know the easy words, but I'm going to use the easy words to teach you some strategies. And then when you know those strategies, we're going to apply them to the harder words. And we're going to see if you can use them to decode harder words. The vast majority of learners, in my experience, when you do that, go, okay, let's try that. They don't go, oh my God, we're back to the basic words. So I do think there's a degree of how you handle it. And my experience is that literacy tutors are really excellent at doing that. They're extremely sort of diplomatic, they're good politicians, and so they can present that information in a way which is palatable to a potential learner. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Good.
And Michelle, there's a follow-on question there from Muna. I see exactly what you mean. Is there one particular synthetic phonics resource that you feel might be particularly good for an ESOL learner who is somewhat of a foundation in reading?
Okay, well, in terms of resources, I suppose the challenge has always been, for as long as I've been doing it anyway, to find adult appropriate materials. Because if you consider graded materials, starting with sort of CVC, there really aren't a whole lot. So there are two answers to this. One is there are a few. I've kind of trawled the world now at this stage, the internet, and there are a few. There's a few from Australia, quite funny ones about kind of ants in your pants and things like that. There's a fantastic writer, Frances Woodward, and she has developed a series of books and a series of kind of mini books that can be printed PDF format. If you don't have them available to you in your ETB, I strongly recommend that you torment your ALO until they, provide them for you. And they're extremely graded. So she starts with really sort of, CVC, and she works her way up right up through to quite complex reading. And it's done very systematically. And they are, I would say, adult appropriate materials. There's no kind of little butterflies or sort of childishness. You have to torment your ALO, absolutely. So the other side is that I myself, within the DDLETB, we are currently developing a program designed to teach what we call ELP learners, which is ESOL literacy provision. In other words, people who don't have English language and they also can't read and write. So they're kind of, it's a double whammy. They basically don't have either skill, and so they are really, really, really starting from scratch. And along with that, we are developing a range of materials. There's a whole program that we're developing. So we're developing the program, we're developing the training for the tutors, and we're developing a set of materials which go along, with the teaching and the program. And we are hoping to roll that out over the next couple of years. We're quite excited about that. Well, I'm very excited about it. And my ALO is excited when I torment her about it. And, but it's definitely an area that I feel all tutors sort of struggle to find the right materials, but there are materials out there. The Francis Woodward is one is very good. And if anybody would like to approach me, contact me privately or on my email, I think Fergus, you'd be
I can
happy
send
enough
it
to
to
provide
anybody
that to
who
anybody who
wants
needs
that.
it.
Yeah.
I have no real problem with sharing stuff, or putting stuff out there.
Thanks.
I also strongly recommend that everybody do the training when it comes around, which hopefully we'll be rolling out across the ETBs over the next year or two.
So just so you know, it's starting in Dublin, Dunleary, ETB, and then you're hoping to roll it out.
Yeah, it's
Fantastic.
up and running already in Southwest EDL ETB. So
Okay.
we already have what we call ELP program running in Clondalkin, Luke and Tala. We're going to be rolling it out around the rest of the DDL ETB, which is all of the suburbs of Dublin, and then we'll be going out to the other ETBs in due course. The name of the
Michelle.
program is ELP, Foundations in Reading ELP.
Okay, thank you. There's a question, Michelle, from Sally. Do learners have to learn the phonetic alphabet and use a dictionary for unknown words?
Sorry, are you referring to the phonetic alphabet that is used in language learning? Is that the question? I just want to clarify.
Sally, do
Absolute.
you want to unmute?
Yeah, sorry, I meant the phonemic alphabet,
Yeah.
all the symbols.
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In fact, I wouldn't recommend using that at all, because we are talking about learners here that already have quite a lot of stuff to take in. And the whole idea is to make it as simple and as sort of systematic, step by step by step. So we actually try very hard to avoid adding any unnecessary learning, So, for example, it's well into the program before we even talk about the word vowel, even though the learners are learning vowels, and there's a heavy emphasis on vowels and vowel spellings, but we don't need to remember what is a vowel, what is a consonant. We certainly don't need to know words like phonemes and graphemes. And even the worksheets that we have designed don't have a lot of unnecessary text around them, so there aren't sort of a lot of instructions to the learner and things like that. My whole sort of approach is, not to bamboozle the learner. Not to bamboozle the learner with any more information than they need. And the idea is that at each stage they are presented with a piece of information and a skill that they need to learn and develop, and then we add and we add and we add. But the whole idea is that it's not a whole lot of information coming at you at the same time. So my feeling about those, unless you happen to come across a learner who already knows them all and you want to use them, I would avoid them at all costs. Yeah, not necessary would be my personal opinion.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Michelle, somebody just asked for the name of the course again, please. Could you just say that?
Yeah, so the course that we're running at the moment, or the program that we are delivering in DDLETB, we are currently calling it Foundations in Reading. And then the one for people for whom English is not their first language is ELP, Foundations in Reading. ELP meaning ESOL literacy provision. And if I can just say that we started with ESOL learners for the very simple reason there was no great sort of I don't know what you'd say, that there was a very, very basic reason, which was that we were inundated with learners. And in many ways, it could be said that I developed this program in response to that. As many of you will know as tutors, if you have taught this, that most of our inspiration and sort of brilliance comes from being inspired by learners and kind of lying in bed at night and going, how am I going to teach this, Joe who just isn't getting it, or how am I going to figure out, that person or whatever. And so that was how we kind of came up with this to start with, was that we were faced with all of these learners for whom ESL wasn't working in the traditional format that we had been used to using, and other literacy approaches weren't working because they couldn't speak English or Irish. So we had to come up with something better to address those needs. And wonderfully, what we have discovered is that what works for the goose is also good for the gander. So what we have found is that this approach, the synthetic phonics approach, is also really useful for people for whom English is their first language, and people who have struggled. And I suppose what I would say is that to some extent, if you have an approach that works for everybody, including people who have dyslexia and people who have maybe some learning challenges of other nature, of other types, then you don't really have to worry too much about all the assessment and everything. You can just teach, and it works for everybody, theoretically.
Michelle, we've got one last question here
Mhm.
from Ruth. Please, can you give an example of how you would start hourly and orally introducing a group of sounds and blending before showing letters? Have you time for that?
Okay, let me see. Okay, yeah, I'm thinking of a group of people who recently came to me, and they had come from Afghanistan and various other countries, and it was literally day one. So this was their first time to ever be in any school in English class. And what I do is, this is literally kind of, I do this every time. So I will pick up something like a cup, and I'll say cup. And then I'll say, when I say the word cup, now they don't know what that means, but I say it so many times that after 6 months, they sort of start to realize what I'm saying. So there's a few sentences that I use, which I'm going to use repeatedly and again and again. When I say the word cup, three sounds come out of my mouth. K, oh, okay. So, k, oh. There's something about the visual representation of the sounds coming out of your mouth like that that can almost visualize, so that a learner who maybe is used to focusing on visual and is not comfortable with the phonics approach likes the idea of the sound literally coming out of the mouth. And then I go k, oh, just to show that the order, it has to happen in a certain order. K, oh, p, cup. Okay. And then I write it on the board. Up. I kind of do three spaces, and then I go just, okay, so k, and I go, this is a spelling for the sound k. Okay. Again, they don't know what this is a spelling for the sound means, but I plan to say that about 75 million times in the next 6 months, so they get used to hearing me saying it. So what happens is that there's a few kind of set sentences that they get so used to me saying it that it becomes like, okay, we know what she's talking about here. So then I would use like a bin, a bag, whatever happens to be in the room, a pen, you get the idea, CVCs. And I say, when I say the word pen, three sounds come out of my mouth. P, eh, mm, you know? So what I'm doing at this stage is there is no visual representation. I'm presenting it orally first and then visually. I hope that makes sense. Um, yeah, I hope that makes sense. And learners get used to routines. They like routines. So what happens is they come in, and once they've learned we start with the 32 sounds, which is kind of the basic 32 sounds. They move on then to, I go, okay, everybody, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they all know that that means we're going to do a little 10 words, and then, so whatever 10 words we're going to work on that day. And then number one, I will go, k, oh, this is at the point that they have now learned that this little squiggle means k, this means and this means, and they write the words. Then we go back and we look at what they've written and we go k, p. What is that? K, up, cup. Now, in many cases, they have no idea what a cup is, so they're learning to decode and read before meaning. Then we bring along some nice worksheets with pictures of cup and pen and whatever, and we apply the meaning to the word. But the learner has already learned how to read the word before they even see the word written down. They've learned how to blend it, then they learn how to read it, and then they learn the meaning. So it's about the order of play. It's not that we don't want to tell them what the word means. It's about the order of play. That is what is most important. And what I'm suggesting is that this order of play is the most universal design that I've been able to find when it comes to teaching this type of reading.
Thanks a million, Michelle. Sally just put a message saying that demonstration cup, etc., was really helpful. Thank you. And a
Okay,
few others
great.
have said that. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm afraid we have to come stop. It's 2 o'clock. Michelle, thanks again. You're, as always, you're absolutely fantastic, and your enthusiasm is infectious, definitely every time.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for putting so much energy and effort and prep into this. I think people really enjoyed it. You can see.
Thanks
Um,
so much, everyone, for listening.
I know, Michelle, you've said a bunch of times before and today that you're fine with your email address being shared and someone can email you
Yeah.
with a question. So I put your email address in because I know you
Mm.
okayed that before and today. So yeah,
And if you're in an ETB, please do get your ALO to talk to my ALO, get your AEO to talk to my AEO. That's how it happens. Just keep at them and saying, this is happening. Can you find out about it? It really does, it gets there eventually. You just have to keep saying it.
yeah. Okay, thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it. We have another webinar tomorrow at 1, ESOL on social and emotional health, and then on Friday morning at 11, we've got AI and ESOL resources. So maybe you can join us
Yeah.
for those.
Fergus, sorry,
Yeah,
just sorry, no, you're about to say goodbye, but someone just put in the message there. Can I share the slides? Just to say to you, I've no problem sharing the slides if anybody
great.
wants that. So
If you send them to me
yeah,
now,
I'll send them to
Michelle,
you.
I'll send them out to everybody.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
happy to do that.
Thanks a million, everybody. Thanks, Michelle. You're fab. Bye bye.
Bye bye.